Yeah, so let's start. I guess maybe some of the audience is not familiar enough with neural networks. So the purpose of the talk is just to give you a brief and gentle introduction to what neural networks are, and hopefully to give you some motivation why is it interesting to study them. And hopefully in the last few minutes, I'll manage to discuss the results that we are having in this paper. So let's start. What is a neuron? It's basically a computational unit. And what exactly does it do? It just takes an inner product from some input x, like a d-dimensional real valued vector, and and this neuron has a fixed set of weights, W1 up to WD. You take the inner product between those two, and then basically the network outputs the sign of this inner product, whether or not it's positive or negative. So it's a very basic processing unit, and it's like neuron in the brain in the sense that it fires or not. So like in our brain, if you're familiar a little bit with biology, this set of weights correspond to synapses, basically the connections between every neurons in the brain. So you have one neuron fires towards another neuron, and it gets multiplied by this weight or synapse, and then you do more and more of processing of information. So for the most basic building block, which is just a single neuron, basically what you're calculating is whether or not you are from one or one side of a hyperplane W or the other. So basically this is what just a single neuron does. It just tells you whether or not you are from one or the other side of some hyperplane W. And now we can generalize it a little bit more and discuss a neural network. And specifically here, it has just one hidden layer. So our output is still some real valued number. But now, again, you get an input as a d-dimensional vector. And what do you do? And now, instead of having just a vector set of weights, now you have a matrix. So you multiply this matrix by the input x, and then you apply something which is called a non-linearity. So basically, this value is basically the maximum between 0 and z. So it sort of mimics, again, neurons in the sense that if the inner product is negative, then this specific, first neuron does not fire at all, so its output is 0. And the more the input correspond to the weight vector that is incoming towards this neuron, then the neuron fires stronger and stronger. So what is now a neural network with one hidden layer is just applying a matrix onto the input x. So in this case, we have k neurons in the hidden layer. So for each of these k neurons, we apply this non-linearity. So whether or not they fire or not, and how strongly do they fire. And then in the end, we're again taking an inner product with this vector v. So just to make things simpler, we first multiply by a matrix, apply a non-linearity, and then take an inner product with a vector. So M for a matrix and V for a vector. And this is the output of a neural network. And ReLU is also shorthand for rectified linear unit, because you rectify here this part of the identity. Okay, so this is a neural network. So now one can ask, okay, as a mathematician or a computer scientist, why do we care about neural network? So the thing is about neural networks, they perform very well in practice. As I guess you all know, they use it in a lot of image classification task in autonomous driving. I guess people might even use them to invest in stocks. So they work very well in practice. In some applications, they even surpass human performance. But there is lack of theoretical understanding, and there is no robust performance guarantees when working with them. So as a mathematician or a computer scientist, when there's something that you can't really explain, I think this is already a nice motivation to try to play with these models. So now we are interested in theory. So the theoretical aspects of neural networks have generally, you can consider three parts in them. One, which is expressiveness, the second is optimization, and the third is generalization. So let's just quickly go through all these aspects. So expressiveness, so in the previous, one of the previous slides, you saw one typical type of architecture for a neural network. It had one hidden layer, and what exactly did you do there? You took your input, you multiply it with a matrix, you apply a non-linearity. In this case, it's ReLU, but it can be any other kind of activation. There are many more. But usually in practice, this ReLU activation that I presented is being used. And then you take an inner product of, after applying the ReLU with another vector v. So this is one type of architecture. What we did here with one hidden layer, now you can basically generalize it to a neural network architecture with many, many layers. And all kinds of different interesting tricks that a lot of practitioners use in practice. But what I showed you is basically these are the basic building blocks of neural network. You start with your input, you apply with a matrix, then apply a nonlinearity, then multiply with a matrix again, and nonlinearity again, and so on and so forth, till you decide enough is enough. So this is, I don't need any more layers than that. And then you see what is your output. So many people are considering questions like, okay, you have a specific type of network architecture with some nonlinearity, so and so many layers. Now you can ask yourself, okay, but what kind of functions can it represent? So this is a very natural question, and it was already studied by Minsky and Papert back in the 70s, I think. And basically they brought something which is called AI winter, but never mind. And the second part is optimization. So now let's assume we are trying to learn some function f, and we're also given a sample, so a fixed sample. The space is a real dimensional d-dimensional vector space, but we are getting a finite sample of this function over this space. And now the question is, okay, let's assume our neural network can actually approximate this function. But now the question is, can we find a set of weights to fit our data? And this is another question. Now, this is basically a type of an optimization type of question, whether or not we can fit the data that we are given. So in the example of a single hidden layer neural network, like we discussed before, what we want that v times ReLU of m xi will equal f of xi for all I. So this is the second type of question. And how do you usually do this optimization process? You're doing it by stochastic gradient descent. And what is stochastic gradient descent? So our neural network N has some output on an instance X, and it's parameterized by the set of weights W, as we discussed. And how do you change the weights at each iteration? So you initialize your set of weights in some random way usually. So you start at time zero from some initialization. And at every step, what do? You have some loss function over the set of weights and the instance X. You calculate the gradient with respect to W, and then you're going in the direction which is the opposite of the gradient, because you basically want to minimize your loss. And the loss can be the squared loss or any other imaginable, reasonable loss function that you can think of. And there are many loss functions that people use in practice. And so this is what you do. You're taking small steps in the opposite direction of the gradient with respect to the weight space. So this is usually how do you optimize a neural network. And now the final part, and maybe the most intriguing to me, is generalization. So now let's assume we already know that our neural network can actually approximate this function that we are trying to learn, and also we have an efficient optimization algorithm. Now the question is whether or not can we generalize over new instances that we didn't see. So the question is whether or not our network just memorizes the sample and maybe it will do horribly on new instances, or whether or not it actually learns something. It actually learns some inner structure in the space. So what we care about is minimizing the loss with respect to this unknown distribution that we are assume we got M IID instances from this distribution and the function that we are trying to learn. So from a finite sample, we hope to achieve low error over the entire distribution, over instances that we actually didn't see. So this is the notion of generalization. And what's interesting, usually you are used to, in statistics in general, basically you want that the number of parameters that you work with will be strictly smaller than the number of samples that you actually get. In neural network, because otherwise like the common wisdom was that you will probably overfit in the sense that you will be able to fit your data well, so your output function will be able to fit all the instances that you saw from your sample, but basically on new instances you will generalize horribly, so your true error will be large, not arbitrarily close to zero. And the thing is, when you're working with neural networks, this is actually the case. You have a lot more parameters than actually than the number of samples. And nevertheless, by some magic that people are trying to understand, the neural networks do not overfit the data. Even the fact that they have a lot more parameters than samples, they still manage to make the true error small. So basically, this is the question of generalization. So now we can discuss our paper and what was our motivating question. So we were asking whether or not a neural network, we were thinking whether or not a neural network can learn the parity function. And what is the parity function? It is well studied in computer science and mathematics. So basically, you get a binary d-dimensional vector, and the parity function basically calculates whether or not the vector x has even or odd number of bits. As you can see here in the definition, you just sum the number of bits and you output 1 if this number is even and -1 if this number is odd. And because it's a fairly natural function that appears in many theoretical aspects, we thought of just trying to answer this question. So now the thing is, one can basically show that the parity function can be represented with a neural network with one hidden layer. And so basically what can you do? You can just take the set of weights that represent this parity function and just start from this point. But this is of course kind of cheating. So in order to make the problem more interesting, you can take the parity function to be in part of a class of function which is large, and then you can ask the question whether or not you can learn any function in this class, including the parity function. So now, because you don't really know in advance what kind of function you encounter, you have to make things a lot more general. So you cannot really start from initialize the network with the set of weights that represent the parity function. You have to start from maybe a random guess for this set of weights that hopefully will get you to the right solution, independent of the function that is being sampled. So one type of class of function which is natural to include the parity function in is the class of symmetric function. That is all functions that are permutation invariant. So the value of the function does not change if you take this binary vector and permute it with any permutation. So this is the class of symmetric function. And we were able to show these three aspects of neural networks that people study with respect to the symmetric functions. So what were our results? So one was expressiveness. So we show that if you take a neural network with one hidden layer and 4D neurons and ReLU activations, you can basically represent any symmetric function. So basically, this is a necessary condition because if you want to learn a symmetric function, you must know how to represent it. The second one included the optimization part. So of course, now you get a sample, an arbitrary sample of a symmetric function. What you want to show that when you're doing stochastic gradient descent, that is that in each iteration, you get this instance, and then you optimize over the loss in the opposite direction of the gradient. We were able to show that you can fit S in an efficient way, and that is after only poly-D updates. And but the thing is, we were able to prove this type of statement using a specific, a special kind of initialization for the weights. So usually in practice, how are the weights initialized for a neural network? They are basically initialized in an IID fashion. So all the weights are initialized usually with some unit variance in an IID way. But empirically, if you do an experiment and you get a large enough sample, so basically it's a complex enough optimization problem, you see that from random initialization with this unit variance, you cannot really fit your data. But if you consider the special structure of this class of function with all these symmetries, you can basically come up with a special type of initialization that allows you to optimize over any sample, assuming that it came from a symmetric function. So this is how we use the fact that all the symmetries, we take that into account when we initialize the network. And finally, for generalization, so let me just state quickly a fact. If you're trying to learn an unknown symmetric function over some unknown distribution up to up to an error epsilon, So up to an error epsilon, you require a sample of size d over epsilon. And this is tight. What we were able to show that, and this is using not necessarily a neural network, but some general learning algorithm. Any learning algorithm will require this number of samples. So basically, with our theorem, we were able to prove that when you use a neural network, this number of samples is actually sufficient using a one hidden layer with 4D neurons to learn any symmetric function over any distribution. And in this case, we see this phenomena of overparameterization, that although the number of parameters is strictly larger than the number of samples, we still are able to generalize very well. So here you can take D to be much larger than 1 over epsilon. And our theorem still holds. And finally, as an open question that we were not yet able to answer is why a neural network cannot learn the parity function or basically any other random symmetric function from random initialization, because this is what we see in practice, and I think this is still an interesting question to understand about the intricacies of this optimization process and generalization. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll be happy to answer any question.